This is
A
it.
shard of cold light split the ruined hall as Aurelius lifted the cracked obsidian mirror.
The dawn
Suspicion
blade.
tightened the narrator's grip on his worn leather notebook when a shard of unnatural glare cut through the ceiling-esque collapse. The narrator
What is
moved
happening
forward on
now?
quick, measured steps,
The world
notebook held against
is
his chest,
changing.
watching initiates kneel in a ring and seeing Lyra hesitate at the circle's sedge. The moment was violent and precise, a reflected slice of sky, a thin white fracture, and the sound of cloth against stone. The narrator had been tracking late, antique sects for years, cataloguing sermons and marginalia, and he kept his evidence in tidy columns and dates. He had come to this ruined basilica that evening because a local scribe sent a page stabbed with ash and a single claim. A public rite was planned to make the city's people see that the world was broken. That claim guided him now. Suspicion seeded each step he took and pushed him to watch every hand movement and jawline for proof. He wore fingerless gloves and kept the antique brass magnifier on his cord. Those small props kept his hands busy and his questions sharp. Aurelius spoke without haste. "Look," he said to the ring, "the ceiling will show what the city refuses to name." His voice was low, like metal dragged under water. Lyra's fingers brushed the tarnished copper amulet at her throat. She breathed once and did not step forward. An initiate in the circle swore softly and fell back on his knees, eyes wide and unfocused. "Who fell?" The narrator out loud, closing the distance between him and Lyra by 2 paces. "Marek," Lyra answered, voice thin. He saw something and could not stand. She held the manuscript fragment in her other hand. Wet dark smears stained one corner. Her fingertips trembled when she set the page on a collapsed altar stone. The narrator did not ask for permission to touch the page. He flattened it against his magnifier, reading the cramped script with the edge of a candlelight. The letters were practical. Ritual steps, supplies, and a phrase underlined 3 times, threshold demonstration. That concrete line reoriented the narrator's investigation from rumor to plan. He noted the time by the candle stub. The rite would be prepared for dawn. Outside the basilica, plaster and amphora leaned against one another under the low sky. The narrator left Lyra beside the altar and stepped into the courtyard where initiates moved like workers folding cloth. He watched Aurelius as the leader traced sigils in the air with one slow fingertip, and the man's cracked mirror hung like an accusation at his throat. The narrator recorded details in short sentences. Obsidian pendant with hairline fracture, missing upper canine tooth visible when Aurelius smiled, braided iron belt. These facts would hold when the rest became noise. Aurelius caught the narrator's eye and said, "Do you seek proof, stranger?" His rasp was soft. The narrator replied, "I seek the document that names your public right." The exchange lasted 3 breaths and revealed nothing obvious. Lyra volunteered a fragment of testimony that night in the scriptorium. She sat with ink, stained fingertips, and pressed the manuscript to the narrator's palm. "We were taught the world is rent," she said. "We were taught to step across the rent and not mend it." Her voice faltered on the last clause. The narrator watched her jaw tighten, and the way her thumb rubbed the ritual scar on her temple. Those visible movements held the story she would not say in full. Why step across? The narrator, "To prove nothing can be healed, Lyra, Aurelius says the spectacle will convince the city. If the city sees the fracture, they will surrender." She pushed the amulet toward him. "Keep the fragment. Please." Her demand was not theatrical. It was urgent and practical. The narrator catalogued the demand as evidence and a pressure point. Doubt moved through him then. Doubt about intervening. Doubt about exposing Lyra to danger. That was the first emotion shift. Suspicion had narrowed into doubt. He did not record doubt as an adjective. He felt it in tightened breath and in the hesitation of his pen between entries. At pre-dawn, Aurelius walked Lyra to a narrow stone threshold outside the cult quarters. The narrator had followed at a distance, listening. He watched Aurelius close when he smiled that late, joyless grin. "Lyra, Aurelius, the world is already rent. We do not repair plaster." We step through to survive what remains. He lifted a ceremonial dagger with a chipped haft and tapped the amulet at Lyra's throat until a fine hairline crack crawled across the copper. Lyra's fingers clenched on the amulet. Her voice dropped to a rasp. "Aurelius, do not break the charm," she said. Aurelius' answer was an aphorism. "Faith without fracture is a lie." He pressed the edge of the dagger into the amulet, and the metal fractured cleanly. Lyra gave a small, involuntary cry and then stilled. The narrator noted the physical change. Lyra's shoulders folded forward, and she breathed in a way that pulled light from her face. At that moment, a neighbor opened his shutter and shouted, asking if everything was all right. The initiates scattered. Some moved into the shadows. Others resumed the ceremonial tasks with urgent hands. An external event had arrived. Curiosity from the street, and the miracle of a town starting to look up. The narrator used that interruption to slip away with Lyra later that night to the subterranean archive beneath the ruined basilica. They worked together to force a rusted lock and descend into the cold. The archive was 3 levels down and smelled of mineral dust and old glue. Shelves leaned with documents wrapped in linen. The narrator read labels aloud in a flat voice to mark time. Lyra's candle threw one steady circle of light on a blood-worn ledger. She turned a page, and a planning note fell out, loose, brittle, and annotated in Aurelius's handwriting. A public threshold right at the city edge with invitations disguised as a miracle. The note specified scaffolding, positioned amphora as reflective surfaces, and named the intended witnesses. The city's magistrates and a handful of traders known for their hostility to change. Lyra put a hand over her mouth. "They mean to make them believe," she said. "They mean to force belief." The narrator answered. His voice did not rise. He folded the note and kept it in his notebook. That discovery changed the case. The narrator's focus narrowed from doctrinal curiosity to public safety and possible coercion. They left the archive with 2 new realities. The cult's plan and Lyra's visible fear. The second emotion shift arrived. Doubt hardened into fear when they imagined the crowd at the ceremonial threshold. Lyra's breathing quickened. She paced 2 steps and sat on a fallen column to press her hands to her knees. The narrator watched her hands shake, and he watched the margin notes in her manuscript, where she had copied Aurelius' sermons in tiny, cramped lines. Those lines now read like instructions for spectacle. During the preparatory night, the initiates sewed robes and painted sigils on palms. The narrator stayed on the edge of the dressing tent and watched an acolyte named Joran argue with a steward. Joran's voice rose. "This will look like a trick," he said. "People will see rope and glass and run." The steward answered, "We need them to see. We need the lie to be real for them." The exchange hardened into a public humiliation. Aurelius walked in, stopped in the tent flap, and spoke Joran's name slowly. "Joran Aurelius, you will stand in the rear and hold the lantern. If you speak again, you will be scattered." He touched the acolyte's face lightly, an act meant to mark and shame. Joran's cheeks burned. He bowed and did not speak again. The narrator recorded the discipline as a method for binding silence and obedience. That technique would matter at the threshold. Lyra was assigned a central role in the rite the next morning. She received the cracked mirror pendant with emotion that asked for acceptance. She put it on and did not lock the cord. Her hands trembled when she adjusted the pendant. The narrator watched and stayed close enough to count the breaths between her words. On the dawn of the public rite, the ceremonial courtyard at the city edge filled with onlookers who had been summoned by rumor and the promise of revelation. Merchants leaned on carts. Magistrates stood with clipped faces. The narrator blended among them, pen hidden, waiting for the exact pivot of the spectacle. Aurelius led the initiates into position and lifted the cracked obsidian mirror. Lyra stood at the threshold, 1 foot forward, the pendant heavy at her chest. Aurelius began the rite with a measured chant. The camera of the narrator's mind catalogued each observed gesture. A sigil traced on ash, a cup passed left to right, a hand lifted to the sky. He recorded the precise moment Lyra stepped forward. For a breath, nothing happened. Then the cracked mirror caught a strip of pale morning light and focused it into a column that cut through the courtyard. The column contained visible flecks of dust that reflected back like small knives. Lyra moved deeper into the light. Her fingers opened and closed on the cord. The narrator felt the crowd's breath hitch. A merchant cried out that he saw a fissure open above the city in the reflected surface. The column of light elongated, and the sound in the courtyard changed. Glass in the distance began to sing, a chorus of high tones that set teeth on edge. The spectacle had the physical effect the cult advertised. People stepped back and clutched children. Then the unexpected happened. A sudden distortion in the column of light bent inward. A sound like a pane cracking echoed, but the sound was not glass alone. An initiate screamed and then was silent. The ground underfoot shuddered for a half-second. A chunk of plaster fell from the basilica's far wall and struck a brazier, scattering embers. The ritual collapsed into chaos. Some ran. Others stood frozen. Aurelius' face changed in a way the narrator had not seen before. For once, the leader's control faltered. The narrator moved forward. He took a ritual fragment from the ground, a small, ash-signed scrap of parchment smeared with pigments. Lyra staggered, one hand on her temple, and then dropped to both knees. The narrator offered his hand. "Lyra," he said. "Lyra, take my hand." Lyra's voice was thin. "Aurelius," she said. And then she stopped as if the name had become something heavy and difficult to say. She lifted her head and looked at Aurelius where he stood at the ring's center, breath ragged, the mirror dangling from his neck. Aurelius moved toward her and the crowd parted like a river. He reached out and placed one slow fingertip on the fractured pendant at her throat. "You saw it," he said. "You must tell them." His tone was not loud, but it carried. A debate broke out among the initiates. Some argued to continue. Others wanted to flee. Joran stepped forward then, the same acolyte who had been humiliated, and he spoke with a voice that did not tremble. "Enough, Joran, we are not gods. We are people who make people afraid." He grabbed the mirror from Aurelius' cord and smashed it cleanly on a stone. The shard skittered across the courtyard and lodged in a merchant's sandal. A merchant swore and stomped the shard beneath boot. The act of smashing the mirror became a pivot. The crowd's fear turned into anger for a few hard heartbeats. Magistrates shouted for order and for guards. Aurelius' face hardened. He stepped back and closed his jaw. The narrator recorded each movement, aware that this was the climax the archive note had promised, and also aware that the real climax was the group's falling trust. After the disturbance, followers staggered and argued. Some clustered around Lyra, others clustered around Aurelius. The narrator seized a scrap of parchment still warm from the brazier and tucked it into his notebook. He watched Aurelius try to restore command, watch his voice become measured and pleading. "We will finish this, Aurelius. We will show them the truth again." A few initiates repeated the line. Most did not. Control had bled away in the shock. Lyra had a new scar across the side of her brow where an ember had grazed her skin. She pressed her fingertips there and made a sound that was not a moan but a small intake. The narrator watched that action, instead of interpreting her as brave or broken. He recorded the scar, the action of pressing, the way her eyelids lowered and then opened. She turned to the narrator and said, "Take what you need. Take it now. If they will not change, the record must exist." Her demand was practical and sharp. The narrator folded his notes and kept the ritual fragments together. He had what he needed: the archive note, the public spectacle, a recorded fracture, and the visible breaking of authority. The emotional arc completed a turn. Suspicion had become doubt, doubt became fear, and fear resolved into a quiet, logical urgency to preserve testimony. That sequence of emotion shifts had driven each decision he made in the courtyard. In the ruined horse-shadowed alcove, the narrator and Lyra catalogued statements and compared marginalia. Lyra read aloud a passage she had copied before the public rite. Aurelius wrote, "When the world convicts itself, it will lose the will to mend." She placed her palm flat on the line as if testing whether the ink remained fixed. The narrator wrote the passage into his notebook and underlined the phrase. He noted the physical habit, Lyra's calloused fingertips pressing ink, and he repeated the phrase aloud to taste its weight. They argued quietly about what to do next. "We can hand the fragments to the magistrates. Lyra, they may burn the notes and call this sorcery." The narrator replied, "We can send copies to scholars in distant towns. We can seal the archive and publish the evidence slowly." He listed options as if ticking boxes in his head. "The people will remember the spectacle. Lyra." Her voice had a small edge. They saw the light. "They may not want rational reports. They will want answers that hold weight in the throat." She pressed her thumb into the new scar and did not look away. Aurelius did not disappear from the ruin after the collapse. He moved alone to the collapsed courtyard edge and spoke to no one. The narrator watched him from across the stone. Aurelius traced a sigil in the dust with a ringed finger, and then folded the tattered stole about his shoulders as if to hide. The narrator noted the man's posture and the way he avoided others' eyes. It was not defeat so much as recalibration. A leadership wound had opened that night, visible in the way Aurelius steadied his breath before speaking to followers. The chapter's small twist arrived in that moment. The narrator found, folded inside the planning note, a secondary annotation in a different hand that named a collaborator in the city government, a clerk who had approved permits and turned a blind eye to public gatherings. The collaborator's name explained why invitations had reached magistrates so quietly. The discovery changed the investigation's direction. This cult had one crooked official backing them. The narrator's chest tightened with a new practical calculus. Exposing that official would change how the city handled the spectacle. Lyra stood and rubbed ash from her sleeve. "We have to choose," she said. Her tone required action rather than moralizing. The narrator agreed. He placed the ritual fragments, the broken mirror shard, and the annotated note into his satchel. He sealed the archive's rusted door behind them with a loose stone and a strip of cloth so there would be physical evidence of entry and exit. They left the basilica in the thin morning light. Outside, a magistrate's clerk wore a clean cloak and walked toward the city with his hands empty. The narrator watched the man's profile and tucked the clerk's name into his mind, as if pinning it to a map. He walked with Lyra a short distance in silence. She kept her hand where the amulet had fractured and traced the crack with a fingertip. The narrator offered no sentiment. He made a plan. At the ruined hall's entrance, Lyra stopped and turned. "Will you tell it true?" she asked, looking directly at him. The narrator replied, "I will record exactly what happened and who stood where." He set the ritual fragment on a flat stone between them, put his palm over it, and then closed his fingers. "That will be the test of what we can do now." Aurelius watched from across the courtyard. He lifted his head and pulled the cracked obsidian pendant higher against his chest. Nothing. The narrator counted that silence as movement. Aurelius choosing not to respond, Lyra deciding to step away from the ring, the city clerk continuing past without glance. Those concrete actions closed the chapter. The narrator pocketed the ritual fragment and slid the annotated note into the inner fold of his notebook. Lyra pressed the cracked mirror into his hand one last time, then turned and walked toward the market with her head down. The narrator watched the amulet settle in his palm and felt the weight of metal and recent ash. He closed his notebook on that small, heavy set of facts and moved toward the magistrate's office to find the clerk's ledger. The day's next decision would be made in the open registers of the city. The immediate conflict of the chapter, the public spectacle, and the breach of trust within the cult had resolved into a concrete plan. Expose the clerk, secure witnesses, and preserve the evidence. The last image was tangible. Lyra's shoulder disappearing into the crowd and the narrator's fingers tightening around the cracked mirror. Emotion root. Suspicion. Lyra stepped onto the broken stone ledge and raised her cracked mirror amulet, while a man farther down the line cursed as the pavings settled under his weight. Suspicion tightened the narrator's jaw. He moved forward with his notebook clutched to his chest, eyes fixed on the amulet and the fissure that split the threshold. The courtyard smelled of cold ash and wet stone. Footsteps scraped, robes whispered, and the portico above held a dozen pairs of watching eyes. Within those first seconds the narrator understood the central problem. Aurelius meant this right to be public, irreversible, and binding in a way the texts did not fully declare. The narrator had come with a ledger of facts, and a distrust sharpened by a prior spectacle. The cracked obsidian mirror from the earlier ritual, the shard of cold light that cut through the collapsed ceiling, and the margin notes he had copied with trembling fingers. He kept his voice low, measured, and precise when he spoke to himself, tapping the edge of his brass magnifier against the page to steady his hand. Suspicion drove his steps. He suspected there was a clause hidden in liturgy, and in leather binding, a clause meant to convert belief into a physical tether. That suspicion shaped every motion he made that night. Lyra did not hesitate on the ledge. She lifted the amulet so the candlelight hit the cracked glass and sent a thin line of reflected light into the fissure. Someone in the ranks muttered, "Lyra, do not betray us," and the line tightened like a pulled cord. Aurelius stood in the ruined portico with his hands folded, ceremonial stole hanging in locked drapes. He said nothing for a long beat, and then spoke. "We do not mend what is not meant to hold," he said in a voice that made the candle flames lean as if for warmth. "Aurelius," Marcellus called out from the crowd, voice cracked by anger, "this binds people. It does not free them." The narrator wrote the line down, fingers moving faster than his mouth could form questions. He watched Lyra's hand quiver once, then set itself steady. He watched Aurelius watch the amulet as if it were a surgical instrument. The stakes were visible. Public right, an initiatory pledge, and a possibility that dissenters would be removed. Within the next minutes the narrator did what he always did when suspicion hardened into inquiry. He moved closer to the lectern by the threshold where a ritual manuscript rested. Its edges singed and ink faded to brown. The document lay open. The narrator's fingers hovered over margin notes he had copied earlier in a different hall. He did not touch the page yet. Instead he recorded voices and gestures, the precise order in which robes unloosed, the placement of a dagger at Aurelius' hip. A clerk in the crowd handed him a scrap of parchment. It contained a list of names, and 2 additional marks the narrator did not recognize. Aurelius's proclamation began without flourish. "We accept the ruin and it accepts us. We are not repairers but witnesses." His words were short and liturgical, built to be repeated. Several initiates fell to their knees and began a low chant. The narrator stepped back and wrote the phrase down in the margin. "Doctrine as mechanism." He watched Lyra press her thumb to the mirror's back, felt the pressure through the line of the crowd. Her fingers left a crescent of blood on the metal frame. It looked small and precise, a ritual punctuation. Aurelius lowered his voice to an aphorism. To bind the present to the crack is to prevent worse harm. He enunciated the element carefully, as if teaching a child a dangerous syllable. Lyra answered him with a whisper that only those nearest could hear. "If the crack is where we stand, then it will choose what remains," she said. And the narrator felt the line of logic click into place like a snapped bone. Doubt shifted through him, not yet fear, but a narrowing of options. He remembered the earlier mirror flare, where a shadow peeled away from a broken arch. That moment had been evidence. Here, that evidence became doctrine. Priestess Selene moved around Lyra with the ease of someone who had marked flesh dozens of times. "Hold still, Lyra," she said. And her hands pressed ritual marks into the young woman's temple. The narrator observed the marks. They matched the fracture motif etched on Lyra's amulet. He noted the exact pressure Celine applied, the way her fingertips left tiny crescents of pale dust on the skin. Celine's eyes met the narrator's for a beat, then slid away. Her expression gave nothing. The narrator recorded the motion as a data point. Hands that make decisions for others. A commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. Marcellus pushed forward with intent in his step and slammed his palm onto the paving. Aurelius, he shouted, this is not salvation. You make a field where we can be taken? Marcellus, Aurelius slowly, you read scripture like a child reads rope. You think you can anchor what is not given to hold. Kneel. Learn the exchange was terse. The narrator moved his pen in rhythm with the voices. Marcellus answered with 3 short lines. You are wrong. You are taking them. I will not kneel to a theft. The argument expanded into a rapid back and forth. Aurelius' pace stayed measured. Marcellus' voice became sharper. Lyra watched them both with a face that softened and hardened in the same breath. The narrator's notebook filled with shorthand. Who spoke exact phrasings, the placement of hands. The crowd tilted toward confrontation. An external event punctured the argument. A torch sconce fell in the central paving and rolled, clattering, into the fissure. The sound cut the voices short and sent hands groping for balance. The narrator heard the scrape of stone and instinctively stepped closer to the lectern, because the lectern held the manuscript, and the manuscript could hold a secret clause. He tightened his grip on the magnifier in his pocket. He found the marginalia only after a careful reading by lamplight. Between votive lists and names, someone had written a clause in a cramped hand. Those who take the right bind their presence to the fracture. The rupture may remove presence at the leader's reading. The narrator read the words aloud under his breath and felt a deeper shift. Suspicion had slid into fear. The clause turned ritual into a lever. It specified a mechanism. That discovery changed the contest. He risked a step into the circle and tapped the page until Celine glanced up. You found it. Lyra whispered, and her voice carried a small tremor. The narrator closed his hand around the page like a shield. We are bound by what we accept, and it is worse than we thought, he murmured. He could not say the word fear in the way a witness might. He had to show it. His thumb tightened on the edge of the manuscript, his knuckles white under thin skin. Pressure from the inner circle increased. 2 attendants moved to Lyra's shoulders and forced her stance upright. They guided her fingers until she held the mirror toward the fissure and the arch, where the collapse had opened a narrow crescent of cold light. Hold, Aurelius commanded. See what accepts you. Lyra's breathing shortened. The narrator recorded the tempo of her inhalations. 4 beats, a catch, and then a forced outward breath. He noted the sound as detail. He did not say it was fear. He wrote it as a data point. Marcellus pushed through the crowd and grabbed at Lyra's arm. Do not do this, he said. Lyra, listen to me. They will take you, or worse. His hand was firm. Lyra's fingers tightened on the amulet. She looked at Marcellus and answered 2 brief sentences. Marcellus, I need certainty. You are asking the wrong thing. The exchange tightened the scene. More voices rose. Aurelius stepped down from the portico, moved slowly, and placed his hand near the fissure without touching it. He spoke an instruction that functioned as both reassurance and threat. Let the fissure show itself. If it chooses for reason beyond our names. Do not block its judgment. The demonstration of rupture began with a small flash. Lyra angled the mirror toward the arch, and a sliver of shadow peeled away from the keystone like a sheet being lifted. The fabric of the shadow did not look metaphorical. It looked like a physical scrap, a piece of darker air that curled and separated with a sound like a string snapping in a windless room. Those nearest stepped back. The narrator felt the hair at the nape of his neck catch. His pulse tightened, and his pen paused above the page. The crowd inhaled. For a moment the question was empirical. A thing had happened in front of them. Aurelius used that moment. He spoke directly to the initiates in measured phrases. Witness now what is possible when you surrender to truth. We bind ourselves so that the fracture can take what would poison us. We decide what leaves us. His phrasing suggested authority and offered a solution to loss. The narrator wrote down Aurelius' exact words and underlined them for repeatability. Then dissent erupted. Two initiates lunged toward Lyra in a bid to wrench the mirror free. A scuffle broke out. Marcellus pushed a cloaked man aside and shouted,
"You bind us like shackles!"
There were 3 rapid exchanges, each line clipped and direct. Marcellus, you forget humility. Aurelius, you forget consequence. Marcellus answered, I do not. Aurelius' retort fell like a flat stone. The physical confrontation forced a sharp choice. Aurelius made a quick, measured gesture, and the crowd stilled as if struck. He lifted the small ceremonial dagger at his side and tapped its haft against the stone once. The sound was deliberate. Then he said, If you attack, you make a choice. Remember the clause. His reference was thin but understood. The marginalia in the mirror made the clause enforceable. Lyra's face shifted. The narrator watched her jaw set, her fingers loosen, then tighten on the amulet. She moved in 3 precise actions. She raised the mirror high, swung it in an arc so the cracked glass caught the moon, and then, in a move that split the night, she either struck the mirror against the keystone or stepped forward into the fissure. The narrator's pen fell from his grasp, and he lunged for a steady line of sight. Then the fissure took. A violent rupture opened with a sound like stone pulled apart and bone shattering. Marcellus was at the center of that motion. He reached for Lyra and vanished from sight. There was no theatrical scream, only a wet, abrupt sound followed by silence so complete the narrator could hear his own breath. 2 cloaked initiates staggered back and began to sob. The narrator felt a physical recoil. His legs refused to move at first. In the stunned aftermath, Aurelius did not rush to comfort. He raised his hands in a manner that suggested ritual and spoke softly enough that only those closest could hear. Observe, he said. The fissure answers to our logic. Priestess Selene moved among the shaken initiates, taking their wrists and checking their pulse with a calm that had the precision of a surgeon. She 3 sentences as she worked. Breathe. Find your center. We will hold you to the line. This is not chaos. This is law. Follow the instructions. The narrator recorded each utterance and the precise shape of Selene's fingers as she worked. He also recorded another fact. A wet smear on the paving where Marcellus had vanished, a thin red crescent that glinted in lamplight. That smear made the absence specific and unambiguous. Someone had been taken. Aurelius immediately converted the event into doctrine. He walked back to the portico and spoke aloud in a cadence meant for repetition. The fissure chooses. We are the readers of its answer. Those who dissent risk removal by the law we accept. The crowd folded the disappearance into a proof rather than a calamity. The narrator recorded this transition with cold precision. He copied the words, not the feeling. He had seen how a demonstration could be converted into a mechanism of control. Priestess Selene shepherded the remaining initiates with efficient motions, pulling cloaks around shivering shoulders and speaking short commands. Line up. Clean the paving. Remember your marks. She ordered 2 attendants to retrieve a length of rope and 3 to sweep ash. The movement pulled the group away from immediate hysteria and toward a ritualized response. The narrator noted the change in posture across the crowd. From panic to practiced obedience. At the lectern, the narrator returned to the marginalia and read it again in full light. The clause was clearer now that it had been enacted. He underlined the words that turned a symbolic act into a causal instrument. Binding presence and leaders reading, he made a new note. The ritual required 2 implements, the mirror and the leader's command, to enact removal. That identification changed the narrator's approach. If the mechanism required both a material object and a vocal trigger, then disrupting either could alter outcomes. He planned in his mind 3 possible interventions and scratched them into the margin. Lyra stood away from the fissure, hands still stained with the mirror's blood. She did not collapse into sorrow. Instead, she paced 3 quick steps, stopped, and then spoke in a voice that had steadiness that surprised even the narrator. "I wanted a certainty. I thought certainty would keep loss honest. I did not mean this." Her sentences were short, each one carrying a neat, painful truth. Marcellus' absence made the words sharper. The crowd listened. Aurelius did not offer consolation. He offered a doctrine. We observed an act, and now we codify it. Those who surrender will not be taken chaotically, but in service of the whole. The narrator watched the assembly accept the wording. How simple phrasing calmed a nervous group. He wrote down the pattern: spectacle, codification, compliance. In the hours that followed, the courtyard quieted. The survivors washed blood from the paving, rethreaded robes, and murmured liturgies that Aurelius proposed. The narrator carefully logged every word and movement. He recorded Selene's exact incantation used to steady the crowd. He wrote down the list of names to be bound in the next rite. He copied Lerus' repeated sentence: "I thought certainty would keep loss honest." Each note became a tether to the knight's truth. The narrator felt an emotional shift again, from fear into a cold resolve. He could not undo what had occurred, but he could make the mechanism visible to others. He rubbed his thumb over his magnifier and laid the marginalia open so the wording could be compared against other liturgical texts he had been given. He planned his next moves in short, concrete terms. Secure copies of the rite, interview Selene, and find any prior enforcement where a leader's reading had resulted in removal. His decisions were methodical and action-driven, a reaction to the event, not to a mood. He also recorded a surprising reveal. While copying a line from the manuscript again, he found a later hand's correction that altered the clause's phrasing from "may remove" to "will remove when commanded." That correction suggested someone had hardened the rite after initial drafting. The narrator marked the correction with a circled note. This twist made him see Aurelius' role not only as interpreter, but as possible author of the enforcement. The character of Aurelius shifted in the narrator's ledger from charismatic teacher to active architect. The final scenes of the night were concrete. Aurelius composed an official recitation and had 2 initiates repeat it aloud until their cadence matched his. Priestess Selene organized a rota to watch the fissure. Lyra wrapped her amulet in linen and handed it to an attendant. The narrator closed his worn leather notebook, but left it half open on the lectern so the marginalia would not be misplaced. He placed a small tully beside the page, one disappearance. Before he left the ruined courtyard, the narrator did one last thing. He counted names on the roster and matched them to the list of those who had taken the rite. He recited them under his breath and found an overlap with a donation ledger indicating property transfers. That concrete link suggested the ritual produced a political instrument. Removal of dissenters cleared claims. He underlined that link and pocketed a copy. The narrator stepped away from the threshold and looked back once. Aurelius stood beneath the portico, hands folded, watching the moon reflect in the mirror's crack. Selene guided the initiates in small corrections to their posture. Lyra sat on a low step, ink-stained fingers worrying the linen that had wrapped her amulet. The narrator closed his notebook on the page where the marginalia named the cost, and Aurelius began to speak of limits aloud. The last sound the narrator recorded was Aurelius' slow line. "We decide what remains." The narrator left with a set of precise actions to take next. Copy, confront records, and protect a witness. The courtyard behind him held a single, concrete absence. A red smear on stone where a man named Marcellus had been. Emotion root, suspicion shifts, suspicion fear cold resolve. Aurelius pressed the cracked obsidian mirror above the stone altar, and the air in the vaulted chamber snapped with a brittle, metallic ring. Suspicion tightened the narrator's jaw before he took another step. He had watched that mirror catch the ceiling light earlier and seen its glare cut the basilicus ruin like a blade. The chamber smelled of cold incense and water-slick stone. Within 5 breaths the narrator understood the immediate problem. The cult intended to make the fracture in the world permanent. He recorded that as action, not as theory. He set his leather notebook between two fallen capitals and raised his brass magnifier to the suppressed pages at the lectern. The narrator had arrived because of the ledger he found in the marketplace, and because Lyra of Antioch had been seen leaving the threshold ritual on the ruined ledge 2 nights before. He touched the edge of a page with the magnifier and felt the tremor of doubt shift into a sharper, practical fear. Fear that the rite would sever the community's access to relics that could repair what was cracked. He did not think about destiny. He checked margins, counted rubric notations, and compared a ciphered sequence to the symbol stitched on Lyra's amulet. Suspicion compelled him to move. That suspicion steered his pen. Aurelius did not lower the mirror. Hooded initiates held the shadowed doorways like sentries. Lyra sat bound at the altar with a linen knot around her wrist. One thin rope dug into her skin. The narrator watched as Lyra pressed her palm to the fracture-shaped scar on her temple, then to the tarnished copper amulet at her throat. She moved with an urgent economy. Quick glances, the pull of fingers at the cord, measured breathing. The narrator recorded each motion. He could not ignore the fact that this was not a private rite. This was a planned act intended to redefine what the living could touch. "Lyra," a voice said from the shadows, "do not let doubt make you flinch." The voice belonged to a senior acolyte whose name the narrator had learned earlier, Casson. Casson stepped forward with a clipped stride, and his boots hit the flagstones with a precise sound. "Casson," Lyra answered, voice small. She tried to pull free of the knot and failed. The narrator shifted closer to the lectern, scanning for the litany that had been removed from public records. Cassian lifted his chin. "We seal what cannot be fixed," he said. His tone tested the knot that bound more than Lyra's wrist. It tested the room's allegiance. He spoke to Aurelius. Aurelius smiled with no humor. "We do not mend a cracked bowl, Aurelius. We accept the bowl's design and worship its fracture." His words were aphoristic, shaped to still listeners. Lyra spat against the stone. "Aurelius," she said, "this is theft. You will take what is left from the people." Aurelius replied with a measured rasp. "Lyra of Antioch, you confuse possession with mercy." He traced a sigil over the mirror with a fingertip. The mirror's edge caught a shaft of light and sent a thin white vein across the ceiling. An initiate muttered in the doorway. The narrator stepped even closer and felt a pressure at the base of his skull. An instinct to preserve evidence, to find the litany that described the sealing rite in precise, mechanical detail. He had found marginalia in the ledger that matched Aurelius' hand. He needed the full text. He moved through scattered rubble to the lectern and pulled aside a toppled folio. The suppressed litany was bound with dark thread and smelled of old wax and smoke. He read aloud under his breath, testing the syllables. "By removing relics of repair from the world, we honor the fracture," he mouthed. The words were concrete instructions. Which reliquaries to unbind, where to lay them, how to recite the seal so that local healing rites would fail. Each line increased the moral stakes. The narrator, as suspicion hardened into a conviction that someone must stop the ritual. He did not immediately know how. He only knew he could not leave with the litany unread. Lyra strained at her knot. "Aurelius," she said again, and her voice sharpened. You promised we would protect the city. This is not protection. This is a cutting away." Her hands were raw. The initiates shifted at her tone. Some eyes softened, others crinkled with the terror of command. Aurelius's smile did not change. "The city cannot be protected by mending things that will split again," he said. "We choose an honest acceptance." Cassian leaned toward Lyra with a short, clipped question. "Was that not always your understanding, Lyra?" he asked. Lyra spat a dark fleck of blood from between her teeth. "No, Cassian," she said. "I did not come to make people poorer." The exchange was quick and sharp. It forced the initiates to his or her side with a motion of acknowledgement. The narrator watched the motion of loyalty like a clock. He recorded Cassion's posture, the way his fingers flexed on the haft of a ceremonial dagger. He noted which initiates flinched when the dagger made a metallic whisper. An early shift of emotion occurred in Lyra. At first her face registered defiance, then a sudden, hollowed fear as she felt the knot bite deeper. She stopped speaking for a heartbeat and pressed the amulet hard into her palm. The narrator made that pause a line in his notebook and circled it. Fear followed defiance. He felt his own reaction move from suspicion to a colder certainty. If the rite completed, repair would be legislated out of reach. He could not accept that without a witness. He began to whisper lines from the litany into his magnifier, learning which phrases matched the mirror's pulse. The chamber had been designed for sound. The vaulted ceiling threw back voices and multiplied them into thin, bell-like echoes. Aurelius raised the mirror higher and spoke a short invocation that scraped at the edges of the litany. The mirror inhaled the light and gave back a pale pulse. The ceiling above the altar shivered. A hairline crack spread across plaster and stone. Dust fell into sheets. An initiate cursed. An older woman in the circle put a hand to her mouth. At this moment an unexpected sign occurred. The mirror emitted a second pulse that struck Lyra's hands and moved up her arm in a path of pale motes. The narrator watched as the motes settled onto Lyra's temple and into the ritual scar from earlier rites. Where the motes landed, the scar brightened. Lyra gasped and jerked. Aurelius' eyes narrowed. For the first time in the night, uncertainty crossed his face. The dynamic in the chamber shifted. The narrator felt his next emotion change. From cold certainty to quick, alert hope. Hope did not replace fear. It informed a new plan. If the mirror's reaction could be unpredictable, then its power could be distracted or redirected. Lyra used the distraction. She kicked at the altar base and bent her shoulders with one hard, decisive movement. Now, she gasped. Now, Cassion, now anyone, do you see? Her voice broke into the room. Several initiates hesitated. Cassion barked an order, 2 words, fast. Hold her. The order tightened the circle. Lyra threw herself again and forced a hand against the mirror's haft. She made a motion that was both surrendering and resisting. One hand pressed to the mirror rim, the other clutched at the knot. What followed was a quick, jagged exchange, 3 lines of back and forth that altered the chamber's balance. Let her go, Lyra. No. You will break the rite. If I break the rite, I break your authority. The words were short and snapped off one another. Aurelius' voice dropped into a rasp. Lyra, he said. You will choose. Lyra barked. Choose what? To steal what little remains. The narrator felt the narrative accelerate. He moved to the lectern, thumbed the litany free, and read the sealing formula aloud under his breath, checking syllable counts against the mirror's pulse. The light fell differently as he read a phrase that matched the mirror's second pulse. A part of the formula demanded a named relic be placed and left unblessed. He realized that the ritual required an object, a reliquary of mending, physically removed from the city's ritual life. He stood, and that discovery was the event he needed to force a choice from others. Stop. The narrator's voice cut through the chamber, not as a scholar, but as a man offering a practical alternative. The sound was not cinematic, it was a command. If you remove the reliquary, you make repair impossible for the people who depend on it. He stepped onto the altar platform, and without asking permission, set the litany on the stone. Lyra's eyes widened, and she mouthed his name. Do not touch the relics, Cassion warned, but his voice had lost some certainty. Aurelius moved to the edge of the altar, and faced the narrator with a measured cold. Why do you interfere? He asked, and his mouth formed the words slowly. The narrator answered with a sentence he had prepared in the marketplace. Because records matter. Because a community cannot be consigned to a single doctrine by a broken mirror. The narrator's tone had no flourish. It relied on clarity and the bluntness of recorded harm. Aurelius' reply was an attempt to reassert control. You cannot hold a city together with ink. A second emotional shift swept the room. Cassion's face hardened into doubt and something like calculation. He glanced at the initiates and then at Aurelius. One initiate, a youth with a chipped coin sewn to his robe, stepped between the altar and Lyra. He had been quiet through the earlier proceedings. "We were told to follow," he said, and the sentence sounded like a question. Lyra seized the moment. She pushed her fingers under the knot and snapped it. The rope fell loose. The sudden action forced a visual reveal. Where Lyra's hand had been, a small smear of mirror dust had collected on her wrist and formed a pale line. The chamber erupted into motion. Some initiates lunged for Lyra. Cassion advanced to seize the litany. Aurelius reached for the mirror. The narrator ducked behind a toppled column to keep his pages safe, and on the same breath tore a leaf from the litany and shoved it into his robe. He moved because evidence mattered, and because the leaf contained the exact rubric that named which reliquary would be removed. The decision moved from theoretical to physical. Someone had to pick up or destroy the mirror. Lyra backed to the altar rim and found the narrator's eyes. His name with a short, hard sound. "The mirror," she said. "Take it." The words forced a choice from her and from the others. Aurelius laughed, low and without joy. "You would break it?" he asked. Lyra's hands were steady. "I will break what you worship," she said. She stepped forward, reached for the mirror, and did something neither Aurelius nor the litany had predicted. Lyra placed her palm flat against the mirror, and then slammed it down against the altar stone with the force of someone who was no longer seeking certainty, but making a definitive, irreversible decision. The mirror's edge struck the stone. A wide, high note exploded in the chamber. Plaster and dust fell in a forehead-splitting gust. The mirror split. A shard flew past Aurelius' shoulder and embedded in nearby column. Light spilled through the new opening and cut across the floor like a bright, wet seam. The chamber's logic detonated. The sealing formula did not complete. The reliquary that had been designated for removal remained where it lay, untouched on a side table. Initiates scrambled. One man slipped and hit his head on stone with a sick, wet sound. Aurelius stumbled and steadied himself with a hand on the altar rim, his face unmasked for the first time. Bare shock, then an attempt to recover authority. "You will pay for that," he said, but his voice was a raw edge. Lyra's chest heaved. She pulled the mirror's largest shard free of the column and held it like an accusation. Outside the chamber, the courtyard above delivered a new event. The collapse of an archway sent a wave of loose rubble down the basilica's face and into the central aisle. Dust and sun fought at the breach. The narrator felt his balance tilt. He moved to collect witnesses and shield the fallen. He took the litany leaf from his robe and tucked it into his notebook under a weighty stone. He could not carry everything, but he could preserve proof that the ritual had been planned. The choice guided his next movement. He stepped toward the stunned initiates and called out names he had learned from earlier margins. "Casson," he said, "you swore to the people." Cassion looked at the narrator and then at Aurelius. He did not answer with a speech. He answered with action. He dropped the ceremonial dagger into a shallow basin and made no attempt to pick it up. 2 initiates followed. This action split the group. Aurelius tried to rally the rest with a low chant, but several voices faltered in the middle of the phrase. One woman, older, placed a hand on Lyra's shoulder and said, "Lyra, you saved us from a theft." The simple sentence broke the ritual's momentum. Lyra sank to the floor among scattered relics. She breathed in short bursts and felt the fresh edge of the ritual scar on her temple, warm and small where the mirror had touched. The narrator watched her press a fingertip to the scar and then trace the line with a precise, studying motion. That motion recorded a new internal shift, from search for certainty to an acceptance of responsibility. Lyra did not declare herself redeemed. She did not preach. She touched the mark and, by that touch, owned the consequences. Aurelius stepped away from the altar and gathered what remained of his composure. He addressed the group with a voice that tried to be both leaderly and injured. "This fracture is not healed by destroying the mirror," he said. "You have made a fierce choice." Lyra answered with a breathless, clear line. "I chose to stop you from stealing what the living use to heal." She looked at Cassian. "You chose to hold a dagger instead of a hand." Cassian met her eyes and then turned his face away. He did not speak. The narrator recorded each of these acts as if charting a ledger of loyalty. He noted that Cassian's silence shifted the group's future power distribution. He understood that his own role had moved from passive chronicler to an active binder of records and witness. He had pushed a cold pen into a live wound, and the wound closed around ink. The immediate fallout required practical measures. The narrator collected fragments of the mirror and placed the largest shard into a cloth sack. He catalogued the reliquary's position in his notebook so the city magistrates could later retrieve it. He urged the uninjured initiates to help with the wounded. He barked short, specific commands: tie this, bring water, lift the threshold stone, because actions were how he could hold the scene together. Lyra listened and obeyed. She moved to bandage a youth whose forehead bled with a neat, red line. When the dust settled, Lyra discovered a new physical mark where the mirror had brushed her temple. A thin red line that bloomed like a cautery. She pressed her palm to it and felt a sting and then a dull ache. She nothing at first. The narrator watched her breathe through the pain and then reach for the amulet at her throat. She placed the amulet against the scar and closed her fingers. "I will carry this," she said finally. Her sentence was a transfer of role. Once she had sought certainty, now she bore a burden. The narrator wrote the phrase down because it meant she had moved from seeker to keeper. Outside, dawnlight seeped into the ruined courtyard through a gap that had not been there at the ritual's start. The narrator climbed to the toppled lectern and closed his notebook with a single, deliberate snap. He slid the suppressed litany beneath a broken tile at the lectern's base, where only records, keepers could find it. He did not make a speech. He walked to Lyra and offered a hand to help her up. She took it. The simple contact fixed a fact. The decision in the chamber had immediate, human consequences. He folded the leaf he had saved and tucked it behind his magnifier. He thought of Aurelius' late smile, of Cassian's silence, of the initiates who had set down a weapon rather than cling to a doctrine. The narrator felt a final shift in his own emotion. Suspicion that had led him to intervention had turned into a heavy steadiness. He was not content, but he had enacted a constrained remedy. The narrator closed his notebook on the toppled lectern, slid the suppressed litany beneath a broken tile, and stepped toward the courtyard where dawn leaked through the collapse. The chapter ended not with an abstract vow but with a practical, audible event. A knock on the outer basilica gate, faint and urgent. The narrator heard it and straightened. He did not speak about destiny or future chapters. He tucked his magnifier into his robe, braced his shoulders, and moved toward the gate with Lyra at his side, one hand still blackened with dust and mirror grit. The knock repeated, stronger this time. That single sound connected the chamber's sealed decision to the city's life beyond the stone walls. The narrator took a breath and reached for the latch. He remembered the ledger entry that had brought him here, the phrase that had led him to the hidden litany, and he knew the next work would be to turn evidence into action for the city. He did not promise redemption. He closed the lectern with the quiet of a man who carries proof. Then he let his hand fall to the latch and answered the gate's knock. A slab of stone broke beneath Lyra's boot, and a man shouted, "Hold the line." The narrator moved at once, suspicion driving his stride as he lunged for Lyra's elbow and felt the grit of collapsing masonry under his palm. Suspicion had been the narrator's engine since he first watched Aurelius lift the cracked obsidian mirror. It pushed him forward now, making him count each footfall and each cry. The courtyard's rim trembled, a shingle of dawn light slicing the abyss, and the central problem stood plain. The rite would either bind people to the fracture Aurelius promised, or a single action might undo that binding. The narrator's hands tightened on his notebook. He moved because he suspected the cult's ritual had a physical lever, not only words. The opening seconds were chaos. Lyra stumbled back from the ledge, her satchel banging against her hip, and an acolyte reached with an iron chain.
Acolyte, do not step back, Lyra.
Lyra answered with a hard breath. I will not be bound. Aurelius closed the circle with a single step and spoke a command. Aurelius, all who surrender step forward. The narrator heard the rasp of Aurelius' voice, and the soft slap of the mirror's pendant against his chest when the prophet raised it. That single action, Aurelius framing the rite, physical, public, made the stakes immediate. Within a handful of lines, the narrator established context through movement. He had arrived at the villa at prayer, dawn to watch the final rite after the seal of irreversibility had been read in fragments across 2 nights. He remembered the cracked mirror catching the basilica's roof, light in the earlier ceremony, and how that glare had split a choir's chant. He had annotated the tattered sermons, recorded Lyra's copying of the manuscript pages, and circled Aurelius' aphorisms. Each note in his leather book read as accusation. Each entry hardened his suspicion. He kept his brass magnifier ready, his fingers tracing marginalia faster when a ritual phrase looked like instruction rather than metaphor. Lyra's eyes searched the rim and found the abyss. She touched her copper amulet with the nervous habit she always used when frightened. The narrator drew close. Lyra, he said. Step away from the edge, Lyra. I can tee. Aurelius will see me as a traitor. The narrator's voice stayed measured. He could not simply pull her. He needed proof to stop a collective action. Suspicion shifted toward active doubt as he watched initiates line the rim, hands white on ropes and dagger hilts. Aurelius stepped to the lectern. He held the cracked obsidian mirror pendant up so the shallow dawn flashed across its surface. Aurelius, see the fissures. See the world we inherit, he spoke in aphorisms. His voice softened as he added, accept what cannot be mended. The narrator registered the cadence as tactic. Aurelius used cadence to close the mind. The narrator's doubt hardened into purpose. He moved to intercept the prophet. Their confrontation occurred along the ceremonial circle's edge. The narrator pushed through 3 initiates. An acolyte grabbed his sleeve and cursed. Acolyte, who are you? The narrator, I am a witness. I record, Aurelius answered. Then record the letting go. The man's stare pinned the narrator. Aurelius closed the distance, fingers tracing a sigil in the air. The narrator noticed the way Aurelius' fingers trembled when they described the sigil. That tremor was not piety but calculation. The narrator, what will you bind to this fracture? Aurelius smiled late and without joy and said, fate is expensive. We pay nothing. We select. That answer left no room for neutral observation. Tension rose when Aurelius lifted the mirror higher and chanted. The mirror's glass showed a shifting image. Not just sky, but a private scene from Lyra's life. Her mother's hands closing a gate, the exact cut on her temple where she bore a ritual scar. Lyra gasped and drew back. The narrator watched the image settle into a diagram etched faintly on the mirror's back. Lines, knots, and a small anchor symbol placed over a human silhouette. The narrator recognized the type of diagram from a margin note in a sermon he had copied. A sacrificial mechanism that attached individual will to an environmental fault. This was the revelation that changed control in the circle. The ritual required a living tie, an iron chain bound to a person, keyed by memory and mirror. Lyra, Aurelius, you cannot do this to us. Aurelius, you misunderstand. Lyra. You have always been the same. The narrator's suspicion shifted into anger. He lunged between 2 acolytes as they moved with a ringed iron chain. The narrator grabbed the chain, fingers finding cold metal, and pulled. A short scuffle began. Dust rose, a rope snapped. Someone shouted. In the brawl, the edge of the ledge began to crumble. The narrator felt small stones roll away beneath him. The narrator, step back. The stones will give way, an initiate answered. He promised order. Lyra pushed and cried, "Stop." Their voices cut over each other in quick bursts. The narrator forced Lyra away from the line and toward a narrow alcove by the lectern where the lectern's wood still held scorch marks from earlier rites. He used the lectern as a shield and put his body between Lyra and the circle. Lyra pressed against him, breathing fast, fingers curled on the amulet. The narrator's hands shook when he opened his notebook. He needed to record the diagram, but also to find the leverage Aurelius used. He flipped to an earlier page where he had copied a phrase from the manuscript. To bind is to render permanent, the offered failing. The phrase had been abstract then. Here it read like instruction. A sudden mid-ceremony event forced everyone to freeze. The mirror flashed and projected a line of light that traced around the courtyard, tapping iron chain points on initiates' wrists like a measuring rod. Each tap made a faint metallic ping. The initiates murmured, measuring breaths suddenly shallow. The narrator used that pause to question Aurelius directly. "Narrator, what happens to those you bind?" "Aurelius, they hold the rent. They will feel the fracture in place of the world." "Lyra, you mean pain and fate, not protection." Aurelius answered, "What you call pain, I call proof," the rapid back. And fourth hardened viewer's sense of crisis. At that point a younger initiate, one named Cassian, who the narrator had seen copying marginalia at the seal of irreversibility, stepped forward and spoke in a voice that shook. "Cassian, Aurelius, this is not what we were told. Did you promise this?" Aurelius' face tightened. "Aurelius, Cassian, you were promised shelter in honesty, Cassian. We were promised safety, not sacrifice." The exchange revealed a twist. Several initiates had been recruited with one promise while Aurelius' ritual relied on a different bargain. The narrator had evidence now. Aurelius manipulated language in sermons to conceal the binding mechanism. This changed how the narrator saw earlier events. What had looked like voluntary surrender in the threshold of surrender was, for some, deceit. Arguments escalated into a standoff. 3 initiates encircled Aurelius, and 2 others dragged a heavy iron chain toward Lyra with mechanical obedience. Aurelius moved like a man accustomed to being obeyed. He extended his hand and touched the mirror's rim as if to steady the vision. "Lyra, I will not be part of this," the iron chain clicked. The narrator looked for a physical decision to unmake the ritual and found only the one obvious lever, the mirror itself. He knew from the seal of irreversibility that the mirror served both as lens and mnemonic anchor. If the mirror fell, its projected diagrams and private images would collapse. The narrator's internal shift progressed from suspicion to clarity. He had a plan. The narrator reached the lectern's edge and, with Lyra's small, deliberate help, began to pry the mirror free from its hanging cord. Lyra's calloused fingertips worked the knot. She bit her lip. The narrator, "Give me a sign when you are ready." Lyra nodded and whispered now. At that moment an acolyte grabbed Lyra's shoulder and pulled. The narrator reacted. He shoved the acolyte, and the 2 of them broke into a scramble that moved like a game of sharp stones. The narrator grunted when an elbow connected with his ribs. Lyra shoved and used the moment to wrench the cord free. The mirror slipped out of its pendant setting and hung by a single thread. The narrator felt the thread in his fingers, a taut filament between promise and ruin. Aurelius saw the movement and lunged. His hand closed on the pendant, but Lyra twisted, flinging the mirror over the abyss. The narrator heard the mirror hit open air with a high, glassy note and then a dry, metallic clatter as it struck the broken parapet. The mirror shattered mid-fall. Its pieces dispersed like percussion across the courtyard's stones. Lyra had chosen a decisive, irreversible act. This was the climax the beats promised. The object of ritual authority destroyed. Aurelius swore and reached. His fingers tore at Lyra's sleeve and found only empty cloth. He staggered. Initiate scattered. The narrator caught a fragment that skittered toward the lectern and found a jagged shard the size of a palm with a faint diagram still visible on its underside. He pressed it into the palm of his gloved hand and felt the cold bite of broken obsidian. The courtyard shifted in response, stones slid, a rope fell, and one of the outer initiates lost balance and rolled free from the rim, saved only by an outstretched hand. Aurelius reacted not with prayer but with fury. He kicked overturned ritual paraphernalia and spat out a line. "Aurelius, you think this frees you? You are shallow in your revolt," Lyra answered between breaths. "I will not be your anchor." The narrator stepped between them and raised his notebook like a shield. He recorded Aurelius' words verbatim because he needed a legal and moral account. Then he noticed Aurelius' missing upper canine tooth set in the mouth like a deliberate fissure. The narrator had seen that detail before, and now it resembled the cut in Aurelius' rhetoric, something he used to puncture and frighten. The immediate fallout was disorder. Initiates fled into the villa's ruined corridors, dragging cloaks and small ritual items. Some accused each other with names. Cashin called out a charge. "You led us here for sacrifice." An older acolyte named Marcellus shouted, "Stop lying about what was promised." The narrator moved among them, collecting names and short statements. He let small confrontations unfold and recorded the concrete claims they made. The narrator's emotion shifted again, from clarity to cautious sorrow, as he saw how many had been missiled. He thought of the earlier threshold of surrender when Lyra had stepped to the ledge with a cracked amulet. That image now read differently. Recruitment through partial truth, not full consent. Aurelius made a final attempt to reassert control. He drew a thin iron chain belt from his robe and began to recite a closing formula intended to reframe the shattered mirror as proof against disbelief. The narrator perceived improvisation. Aurelius' voice wavered with fear this time. Acolytes circled him out of habit rather than conviction. The narrator watched the prophet's mannerisms, slow fingertip tracing, a late smile, and realized that Aurelius depended on ceremony to hide contingency. Without the mirror's large projection, ritual authority weakened. Cashin stepped back into the courtyard center and spoke with a voice that no longer hid. "Cassan, Aurelius, tell us plainly, who pays the binding?" "Aurelius, those who surrender, Cashin. But you promised we would not be sacrifices." Aurelius' face sagged. He could not keep the aphorisms layered. The narrator noticed that the leader's plan had been to conceal sacrifice under rhetoric about acceptance. The plot twist confirmed a darker truth. Aurelius intended to use people's lives to stabilize a doctrine of irreversibility. In the aftermath, the narrator collected shards and testimony. He wrapped the largest shard in cloth and tucked it into his notebook's spine, keeping it both as evidence and as a dangerous object. Lyra sat on a low stone, hair pulled back, hands ink, stained and trembling. "Lyra, I thought surrender would be mercy." The narrator, "You did what you had to do to break the link." Lyra's face had an austere calm. She touched her amulet and found it colder than before. Aurelius, wounded in pride more than body, gathered the nearest followers and walked away from the courtyard toward the villa's inner rooms. He did not flee like a criminal. He moved like a man accepting tactical retreat. Aurelius to one follower, "Regroup quietly." "We are not finished." The follower, Marcellus, said. "Aurelius, many will not follow you now," Aurelius answered. "Then those who remain will be purer." The narrator recorded the exchange. He noted Aurelius' reliance on purification language to maintain cohesion. The narrator escorted Lyra to a quiet alcove and inspected the lectern where the mirror had hung. He ran his gloved hand along scorch marks and found the indentation of burned sigils. He recorded the exact placement of the chain anchors and the geometry of the courtyard rim. He referenced his notebook entries from the ritual of the fractured mirror and the seal of irreversibility and cross, checked the diagrams. The physical evidence matched. Aurelius had built a mechanism that used private imagery and mirror projection to secure voluntary binding. The narrator felt relief and a residual H, relief that a physical undoing had occurred, H for the people missiled. "Lyra, what will happen to Aurelius now?" The narrator, People will decide. You will tell the truth you witnessed. Lyra nodded, hands returning to the satchel where she kept copied script. She took out a sheet, crumpled an ink, stained, and offered it to the narrator. Lyra, I wrote everything I saw. The narrator took the page, slid it into his notebook, and felt the weight of names added to his ledger. Outside, initiates gathered in small groups. Some wanted to drag Aurelius back and force a trial. Others feared reprisal. Cassian argued for public testimony. Marcellus argued for exile of certain leaders. The narrator mediated as best he could, asking factual questions and urging recorded statements. In one exchange, a woman named Helena accused another acolyte by name. Helena, you tied the chain yourself, Marcellus. Why lie? Marcellus, I was told to do it for the order. Helena, order is no excuse. Their dispute clarified accountability in tangible terms and shifted community sentiment toward confronting leaders. The narrator made choices that day with deliberate hands. He refused to turn the shard over to a mob. Instead, he asked for calm, for documented witness statements, and for a public reading of what had been promised to recruits. He organized a circle around the ruined lectern and read aloud Lyra's notes and his own transcripts. The words landed among the crowd like questions that needed answers. Aurelius listened from the villa's shadow and did not speak until asked. When confronted, Aurelius met the narrator's eye and said in a lower tone, "You picked up the shard. Keep it. Record my truth as you will." The narrator replied, "We will record facts and see which promises match them." Aurelius smiled without joy and walked away. The narrator's suspicion finally lightened into an evidence-driven resolve. He would publish and catalogue the ritual mechanics, and the cult's control would be contested by records. The chapter's cliffhanger occurred when the narrator noticed a faint, curved incision on the shard's underside. A second diagram overlaying the first that did not match the manuscript pages he had copied. The new diagram pointed to a location within the villa's substructure, the cistern under the chapel floor. The narrator aloud, "There is more below." Lyra looked up. "Lyra, we must see," someone in the crowd muttered. "Is there another chamber?" The narrator closed his notebook with a firm motion. He had expected the rite to be mainly symbolic. Instead, he had found a built mechanism and now saw a hint of another hidden site. The discovery forced a choice. Pursue the cistern now, when the community was fragile, or secure testimony and return with a team. The narrator chose both. He sent 3 people to guard the courtyard and asked Lyra to lead him to the cistern's steps. They descended into damp stone and reek of old amphora. The narrator kept his magnifier ready, and Lyra lit a small oil lamp. The steps were narrow. The narrator felt the architecture press close. At the bottom, a shallow basin showed iron anchors identical to those in the courtyard. A rope led from the basin to a sealed hatch. Someone had prepared a secondary anchor point beneath the villa. A place where, if the ritual had continued, the community's weight could have been transferred into a subterranean binding. The narrator, "They planned to bury the costs," Lyra, voice low. "We would have been carrying it for them." The physical design proved intent and increased the catalogue of abuses. The narrator heard approaching footsteps above. Voices argued. He and Lyra closed the hatch and carried the evidence up. By mid-morning, a plan formed at the courtyard. Witnesses would be called. A list of grievances compiled. Aurelius' inner circle would be asked to answer specific charges. The narrator insisted on names and specific actions, and the community responded with details: who tied chains, who read which lines, who led recruits. The narrator wrote each name in his notebook. He prevented summary exile. He wanted a reckoning keyed to facts. By the time the sun breached the villa's ruined parapet, temperatures warmed and the courtyard filled with people seeking to hear the recorded testimonies. Some initiates sought to punish. Others sought to protect those who had been missiled. The narrator stood with Lyra and Cassian and read the assembled statements. They matched the physical evidence and the broken mirrors. People adjusted their positions. Accusations traded became organized complaints. In the final minutes of the day, as the small council formed under a battered arch, the narrator slid the largest shard into the notebook's spine and closed his cover. He watched Lyra rise and speak in a steady, short cadence. "Lyra, I will testify about the mirror and the diagram. I will show you the page I copied." The room listened. Cashin volunteered to stand with her. "Cassin, I will tell what was promised to me and what was hidden." Their mutual decision marked the beginning of a public process and the end of the immediate ritual's hold. The chapter closed with a concrete situational beat. The narrator, notebook heavy with evidence, stepped to the ruined threshold and felt dawn wind across his face. He slid the smallest remaining shard into the notebook spine and stepped away from the ruined threshold into the courtyard where people argued and kept watch. Steps sounded behind him. Lyra and Cashin followed. The narrator heard a firm footfall from the villa, Aurelius moving through the inner rooms, and he knew a longer conflict would come. He shut the notebook and walked toward the assembly, shard pressed to the leather, record complete for now, and the investigation only beginning.